Hello, everyone. My name is Shantini Vanderveer. I'm a member of the Diné Navajo Nation, and I'm joining you all today on the traditional lands of Ohlone and Coastal Esalen tribes within California. I started with NAP's team about 3 months ago as the Community Foundation Regional Coordinator, and I'm honored to join you all here today. On behalf of Native Americans in Philanthropy, I'd like to welcome you to our very first member education series of 2025. We're so glad to have you join us today for this important panel conversation on Indigenous journalism. We're privileged to be joined by an impressive group of Indigenous leaders on the front lines of practicing, advocating within, and promoting in the journalism sphere long term. As we know, for generations, storytelling has been a cornerstone of many Indigenous communities. Stories have been used to entertain, educate, share, inform our relatives and all of those around us. This tradition carries on today, carried forward by an impressive group of Indigenous reporters and journalists whose work guides our understanding of the world and current events. Despite their critical contributions, Indigenous representation and voices remain vastly underrepresented in journalism, a field that is still marred by systemic inequalities. So the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives is vitally important to the authenticity and power of stories occurring in and around our communities. An inclusive and equitable news landscape not only serves our people, but also protects our communities and strengthens sovereignty by indigenizing a colonized field. I feel especially honored to join you all here today, especially since I actually studied journalism for my undergraduate degree. Advocating for the right to uplift our own community's voices holds a very special place in my heart. So I'm very excited to witness the conversation alongside each of you and to hear the stories and perspectives of our impressive panel leaders. So to get us started today, I'd like to welcome NAP's Education Resource Facilitator, our MES moderator, Bobby Trey Trousdale. Bobby Trey?
Bojo, Sean, Dean, how are you today?
I'm doing good. I'm very excited.
Good. I am so glad. We are, I think, have such a diverse and unique team here at NAP. So even just knowing that you're coming from this field, so excited to have you joining us in this way and being able to still, maintain that relationship to who we all are outside of our jobs, so to speak. So thank you for joining.
Happy to be here.
You're welcome. Well, and we are so glad to have you here at NAP. So thank you, Shondine. Shondine will be back later in our program. But first and foremost, I do want to welcome you all and wishing you a happy new year and a happy 2025. Whether your calendar is aligned to the 12-month structure, seasons, cultural understandings and teachings, or the solstice, I'm hoping new and comforting energy has surrounded you and yours, or will be soon. We're excited to be back from our winter break here at NAP and are eager to begin collaborating once again on promoting equitable and effective philanthropy in Native communities. To start again, Bojo Nikon, Bobby Trey Trousdale, Nadesh Nakas, Tecumseh, Oklahoma, and Adochbia. Hello, friends. My name is Bobby Trey Trousdale. I am from Tecumseh, Oklahoma, but I'm currently based in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and I am honored to serve as Native Americans in Philanthropy's Education Resource Facilitator. I'd like to start also with just the Chimigwechi again to Shondine for her welcome, centering us in today's conversation and starting us off in a good way. Shondine shared that she's recently joined the NAP team as our regional community foundation outreach coordinator, and we're excited to see the work and ecstatic to have her leading these efforts throughout the South, and cannot wait for you all to see more and more of her throughout our membership and to get to work with her. As she mentioned, today we'll be diving into a conversation surrounding Indigenous journalism. Whether creating new spaces, reclaiming established ones, or operating in new and exciting innovations and spheres, our panelists are bringing tremendous experience, expertise, and presence into this space. While these successful and exemplary professionals lead this discussion, I want to ensure that we're holding space for young professionals and leaders as well. While the new semester and season of life has precluded one of our Native Youth Grantmakers from joining us today, we'll be directing one or two questions their way and want to encourage you and your organization to include and boost leadership within your own communities and beyond each and every chance that you get, in however it makes sense for you. With that said, let's get started. Francine, Jordan, and Brian are all rock stars who not only exemplify the inclusion of the variety of perspectives, but do so while expanding and establishing Indigenous presence and excellence in their words and work. Y'all, as you're called, please introduce yourself and your affiliations however you'd feel comfortable. I'll get started with Brian from AP. Brian?
What all, Bobby Trade, and I'm honored to be here with you today. Brian Pollard, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, currently the Grant Operations Manager at the Associated Press. I started my journey in Indigenous journalism started in 2003 when I joined the staff of the Cherokee Phoenix, which is the tribal newspaper for the Cherokee Nation, and also the first tribal media outlet in North America that was published in both English and Cherokee. It was published originally in 1828. While I was at the Cherokee Phoenix, I also became a member of the Native American Journalists Association, which is now the Indigenous Journalists Association, and was at the Cherokee Phoenix, eventually becoming the executive editor there for about 10 years. Also, simultaneously, I served on the board of directors for the Native American Journalists Association, actually through a couple of cycles. Actually ended up becoming the president in my last few years when I was on the board. I ended up leaving the Cherokee Phoenix, and there was an opportunity to join the Native American Journalists Association on staff, and so I became the associate director. While I was there, I helped develop programs to lift up Indigenous voices and to support our members. I was there for a couple of years and then had an opportunity to take a fellowship at Stanford, where I studied Indigenous journalism and some of the obstacles to press freedom in Indian country. The studies that I started there at Stanford, which actually stemmed from some work that I did at NAJA when I was there, eventually culminated in me actually writing a thesis on Native American free press and some of the challenges to press freedom in Indian country. So today I'm at the Associated Press, where not only do I manage the grant portfolio for the AP, but I also am one of the developers of a proposal to create an Indigenous media and reporting network within the AP that I am hoping will one day be able to not only serve as a platform to create collaboration among Indigenous media outlets so that they can more easily share content, but that can also lift up that content to be shared with the AP's global customer base.
Wow. Well, thank you for bringing all of that into this space. And I'm really excited to see, I think, your perspective both from Cherokee Phoenix, your own academic pursuits, and now at the AP, all of those combined. Very, very excited. I know you did mention the Indigenous Journalist Association, so I want to welcome in Francine, because I feel like we cannot have that conversation without them today. So Francine, welcome.
Thank you so much, Bobby. It's great to be here, and thanks to the Native Americans and philanthropy for bringing us all together for this conversation. Anin Boozhoo, I'm Francine Compton. I'm an Anishinaabe and a citizen of Sandy Bay, Ojibwe First Nation. And for the last 2 years, I've been the associate director here at IJA. Prior to the role that I currently have at IJA, I was the president of the board of the Native American Journalists Association for 3 terms, totaling 2.5 years. And my history in Indigenous journalism dates back to over 20 years ago, actually, 1999, when APTN launched the first national Indigenous television station in the world. I was able to launch a show on the network when it launched. I was a host reporter for a news magazine show. But I wanted to work for the network, which I was quickly able to do that. I was their television director, directing live shows and town halls. I moved on to help start their investigative news program, APTN Investigates, and we launched a political show called Nation to Nation out of Canada's capital. And before I left APTN, I was the executive producer of national news. I left there to go to mainstream. And mainstream, that means I was at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where they're the public broadcaster of Canada, but they do have an Indigenous unit focused on telling Indigenous stories. So that's me in a nutshell. And again, thank you so much, Bobby.
Well, of course, no, we are honored to have you two join us so far. And I'll just say I'm already learning new things. So I know that this is going to be just a conversation chock full of new knowledge, tidbits, and so very glad. I'll continue on with our introductions. And it was shared briefly before the show. I think this may be the first time that I can use the title Managing Editor of Indian Country Today, Jordan Bennett Begay. Jordan, welcome into the space.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. Yeah, a lot of new changes happened, and it just happened this week. So, but yeah, she Jordan Bennett Begay and she kia ani she ma dishkiji bashichi nakadina edasache oze tachini dashanella. I'm Jordan. I'm Navajo. I'm from New Mexico, but I'm based in Washington D.C. At ICT's Washington Bureau. I've been with the organization for 6.5 years now. And it flew by. It's the longest place I ever worked at, which is wild. And it's funny because I see Brian and Francine all the time. So it was really exciting just to be here with them. I guess for my journey, I've been in journalism since 2011 officially, but maybe like full time since 2015, 2016. I actually fell into journalism on accident. I always tell people because my undergrad, I was wanting to be a physician's assistant. So I was focused on sports medicine, and that's what I graduated with. And, I was on that route. But like in undergrad, it was just so time intensive and very science focused. So I thought, I need a break. And I really like to read and write. So I took I looked for a class and I thought, oh, this blogging class would be fun. I had no idea what it was, but it turned out to be a news media writing class. And I got to the first day and looked at the syllabus and I was like, I don't like newspapers. You guys don't understand. My parents made my sister and I watch the news every morning and evening just to keep up on current events. Right. But my professor was really helpful and she kind of helped me along. And I thought, maybe there's something to this. So I kept it as like a plan B and ended up going to grad school for it. So I got my master's in magazine, newspaper, and online journalism. And actually it was really the Indigenous Journalists Association, IJA, which all of us have been a part of, that really changed like the trajectory of my career. And it was actually the fellowship, which I now direct, the Indigenous Fellowship, Journalism Fellowship. That experience told me like I need to be in journalism. And now I'm one of the co-directors for that fellowship with IJA. I've been on the board for IJA for 5 years now. I'm currently their vice president. And I think that's like all about me, maybe. Yeah.
I was going to say, there's always something more, right? But leave the audience wanting more.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I appreciate, I think, the diversity and the different perspectives and backgrounds that we're bringing into this space. And so just thank you all to you for being willing to sit down today, carving out time and space for our audience. And I guess with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I would encourage our audience, please do feel free to say hi in the chat, communicate with one another. But also, if you've got any questions, please feel free to submit those as well. We'd be happy to try and bring those into our conversation for this powerful, powerful panel to address. And hopefully, I don't know if we're going to solve all the world's problems today. I feel like you all can, so I'm excited to just sit back and watch it. But we'll get started. Brian, I'll throw this first question your way is, what are the unique challenges faced by Indigenous practitioners in journalism? And how can these be addressed through funding, policy changes, or other actions?
Yeah, I think, having worked in Indigenous journalism now for more than 20 years, the one challenge that I tend to focus on is the fact that press freedom across Indian country and among tribal media is really inconsistent. There are some outlets that can practice it in the way that you and I may understand it. They have editorial independence and they can tell stories in their voice and in a way that they choose. With other outlets, not so much. Oftentimes their coverage may be dictated by tribal leadership or by tribal government, which may or may not be the full truth of what's going on in that community. And so I tend to focus on what are the solutions to address this challenge. And so what I wrote about quite a bit in the thesis that I published when I was at the University of Arkansas, and also the studies that we have done at the Native American Journalists Association, now the Indigenous Journalists Association, are really the policy aspects. What are the policy implications that tribes can look at to create a firewall between tribal government and tribal media so the tribal media can have an independent voice? What we see is oftentimes tribal media outlets are often very small. They do not have business models that can support them the way that larger mainstream outlets might be able to support themselves. And so they rely on tribal government for funding. And because that funding comes from tribal government, oftentimes tribal government thinks that gives them a say in what is published or what is not published. But I think there are policy solutions to create that firewall so that those outlets can be funded by tribal government, but still have an independent editorial voice. And so that's a significant challenge that I think needs to be looked at really closely by tribal communities, and something I continue to work on.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that. Francine, I'll throw it your way for your perspective, and that was, what are the unique challenges faced by Indigenous practitioners?
I do agree with a lot of what Brian is saying, and that's really what prompted me and launched me into the work is ensuring that our people can tell stories about their own communities without interference from their own governments. And so because Brian spoke to that, I wanna bring up another huge challenge that I've seen constantly over and over again. I want to say for at least the last 5 years, and it's probably been longer, but that's this supply and demand issue that people are constantly knocking at our door for Indigenous journalists and storytellers and, photographers, videographers, you name it. So the demand is there in the industry, but we don't have enough of the supply. And that's because I think the storytellers in our own communities, they aren't networked with organizations such as the Indigenous Journalists Association. But I think it's really us needing to go back to our roots and knowing that storytelling is our inherent right. Our ancestors have been doing that since time immemorial. And, even here in Canada, oral histories have been upheld in the Supreme Courts of Canada. So I really think that that is one of the biggest challenges. And I'll say that even because we have sometimes one individual in a mainstream newsroom, one Indigenous person in a mainstream newsroom. And so they need more than just one. They need an entire desk, such as CBC Indigenous and some of the other Indigenous affairs desks that have been created in the US. And so that can be addressed actually through funding and actions. And that would be in supporting the work that we are all doing. But also, Jordan mentioned the Indigenous Journalism Fellowship. That is the one fellowship that I wish I had when I was going through my formative years in this industry. And I have seen so many people come up through that program. They're now leading newsrooms. They're leading the organization that I'm working for now. And just the other day, I saw one of our recent fellows promoting this year's fellowship and saying how it changed their life, and they know it can change other people's lives too. So that can happen, and it comes with the funding of our young people, our young truth tellers.
Absolutely. Goodness, I cannot wait to hear more about this fellowship. I hope that we are able to really dive into that. And I normally would make the joke, well, I wish somebody would write a dissertation about the things that we're talking about, but Brian, it sounds like you've already done that. So if you could just share that out, summarize it into what we can hit on a broadcast, it will be great. But no, Jordan, I'll throw it over to you now. What are the unique challenges faced by Indigenous journalists?
Well, Brian and Francine hit the points that I was going to make. So I'll drill down. With the tribal free press, I think that's a really key point. Of the 574 federally recognized tribes, only 5 nations have some form of free press laws. And I don't think many people, know that. Many Native people don't know that. There's a really great documentary to give people an understanding of what that looks like. And it's called Bad Press by our IJA director, Rebecca Lansbury Baker. And I encourage everyone to go watch it if you have the time, if it's in your area. And then the other point Francine made was investing in our youth. And I think that's what I've seen in the last few years is just recruiting youth and investing in the fellowship, investing in this young talent that we have. And at least in our newsroom, we have a lot of young people. And so what I've seen too is just people hungry to not only report, but also become editors and lead newsrooms. And so I think that transition in some type of education and mentorship needs to help, because at least from my personal perspective, as I've grown, kind of climbed the ladder at ICT, I had to absorb so much business knowledge and funding knowledge. And a lot of it's very intimidating, but it's very exciting to learn. And it's trying to figure out the, a little more seamless ways to gain that knowledge for young people, because we have a lot of reporters, but I think we need more editors. We need people leading newsrooms. We need Native folks on the business side. We need Native media execs who can, in a sense, infiltrate mainstream newsrooms or tribal newsrooms, because those are the decision makers. They're the ones deciding where funding is going, how to get funding, and trying to help create, this news coverage and representation that we need.
Absolutely. I hope you all won't hate this, but I've got just kind of a softball question I want to present to the group. In something you're talking about, what is the importance of free media? I want to make sure that we're leaving space for that, and space for, I think, as we are bringing in the realities of tribal sovereignty and Native nations having their own ability to govern themselves, their people, and care for their citizens. Brian, what's the pitch for a free press that you would give to, let's say, tribal leadership?
I would say that it's supporting authentic Indigenous voices and an authentic representation of the lived experience of Indigenous people. That is the fuel that really drives self-determination. And to the extent that we can support that independent voice, that we can support organizations that are going to represent the full community and maybe not just the perspectives of leadership, that is self-determination. And so I think that if we want to be self-determined, and if we want to continue to aspire towards self-determination, which is the underpinnings of tribal sovereignty as well, then we have to have press freedom. We have to have organizations that will support all voices in the community in an authentic way.
Absolutely. Francina, I'll throw it to you now, but expand the audience just a little bit from not only tribal leadership, but then how do we pitch it to our relatives, our fellow citizens? What is the point and the importance of having a free press?
I want to quote my favorite quote from Bad Press to start this one off. And that was when Angel Ellis was showing the archives of the Muskogee media. And she said, if you look back at all these archives, you would never think there was ever a problem in the tribe or in the community. And that resonated to me because that reminded me of my own community. And when I started working at CBC Indigenous, we started doing stories on my community, and a lot of money went missing, and positions were terminated. And because we did those stories, people were talking about those stories when the next election came up. So we were providing information to the citizens. We were doing investigations that no other media outlet was doing. And so that's why it's important that we're free to report on our own communities in a fair and balanced and accurate way. But also these stories need to be done because that told me that the citizens of my First Nation had long had no media coverage of the issues that they were talking about and that they were knowing about. And when that time finally came, they used it as discussion points for the next election. They had screenshots from those news articles. And, here we don't have as many tribal owned news outlets as there are in the United States. However, being a former producer at APTN, we did encounter those times where we, as the first national Indigenous television station, we're here to represent our people. And there were actually times where our reporters were chased out of First Nations by chief and council because they didn't want those stories told. So we're encountering some of the similar issues in different ways and on different levels. So to summarize this point, and I think we've discussed it and maybe touched on it a little bit, but our own people, our own citizens, they also need to know more about the media and that literacy and how they can actually communicate with journalists better. And so that's something that IJA has been providing. We've started providing a program called Share Your Story. And so we're building relationships with grassroots citizens, community leaders. We're teaching them how they can have power when they're dealing with the media too. So I think all those things are important to mention when we're talking about free press and access to storytelling from our communities.
Yes, thank you for that, Jordan. I'd of course leave the two audiences that Brian and Francine have touched on, but I really also want to hear what is the importance of free press for the next generation when we're looking to young professionals or we're looking to future. We always are operating for the next 7 generations. Why is it important to have free press included in that?
That's a big question when you put it toward young people.
Sorry, yes, I realize that's a hefty throw to you.
No, you're good. You're good. I think, in terms of working with tribes, I just think of, my own tribal newspaper, the Navajo Times. My mentor, Mark Trahant, was the former editor of the Navajo Times Today back in the 90s. And the stories he tells me, and he tells them publicly too, is when, the paper got shut down, I think after Peter McDonald won his election. And because he won, endorsed it, opposing candidate for one, but the opposing candidate, he endorsed him because he wanted free press and he saw the importance of it. But Peter McDonald didn't see it. And so he totally shut down the paper, and a lot of people left the paper at that time. And so I think that's the power, that of not having free press could have, right? It's silencing your citizens, censorship, having control of what can go out and what can not go out, right? I mean, tribal leaders are always saying, I think it's actually in the Bad Press documentary, Angel Ellis, the main character, was saying how tribal leaders are asking, like, why do you always put us in negative light? Well, she said, don't do bad things. And that's what I think the importance for young people are. And in this younger generation, we're very transparent, and even just the news landscape has changed in that. Like, we're more about transparency, being authentic, and social media, has a lot to do with that. I mean, we have community journalists out there who are Facebook living wherever they are, basketball games, council meetings. I mean, that's I think the future of it. But I mean, again, we're here to kind of hold the power accountable, and the young people are very adamant about that. I mean, I think you see it all over social media. I don't really have much to add beyond Brian or Francine.
No, I think that I wanted to kind of direct the audiences to try and hit, different people that may be joining us. So I appreciate, I think it shows how sharp you all are. That was not a question that you'd prepared. It was just off the dome. And I'm so impressed with how you all have conceptualized that and the importance that it plays. I think in all of your answers, though, there was kind of this, it kept coming back to community and taking care of our relatives, or it kept coming back to this idea of what we have. But I want to also acknowledge the press, or how the power that Indigenous journalism has in the broader public of perception of Indigenous communities. So, Francine, I'll throw it to you first. What role can Indigenous journalism play in educating the broader public about Indigenous issues, perspectives, and even policy decisions?
Thanks, Bobby. Yeah, I had a chance to think about this a lot before coming on here, and I wanna share a story about some stories that we did at CBC Indigenous. In 2022, there was an Indigenous mom. She was Lakota, and she wanted to give her baby a Lakota name with the accents that come with that language. And the provincial government or the state government wouldn't allow it, and also changed the name by combining one name or separating names. And so we started with that one story, that one personal story. Then we had reaction from the chiefs that advocate for our people. So that was story number two stories. After that, the provincial government or the state said that they're going to look into the act that dictates how these names are put on birth certificates. And so 2 stories done by CBC Indigenous. As soon as it goes over to the political level, our colleague in our local newsroom, non-Indigenous, then picked up that story and focused on that legislation and that act and how they were looking at changing that. And I want to mention that there was actually a 4th story from that Indigenous journalist's original one story. The 4th one took us to another part of Canada where another First Nations family was looking at the same problem, where the province in that region wasn't granting them the name that they wanted. So that educated the broader public about the issue, and doing those follows and being diligent and sharing that story with some of your colleagues in the mainstream, they can amplify that. And so the government was looking at changing that act, not only to include those characters or accents, but also to allow room for an Indigenous person who may only have one name and not 2 names on the birth certificate. So that also pushed for some policy decisions to be addressed as well.
Thank you for bringing those stories in and sharing that. That's very powerful. Jordan, I'll come to you next. What role can Indigenous journalism play in educating the broader public?
So there is this one incident or a situation with our political correspondent, Polly Denekla. We're both out here in DC. And I remember she went to a Senate hearing on the Hill, and she came back and told me that the New York Times correspondent came up to her and said, "Oh, you're Polly. I read your stuff. I don't know what's going on in Indigenous affairs, so I read your stuff to understand here on the Hill." And I was like, wow, that is so powerful. Like, even mainstream media need to read Indigenous media's work to get it, wrap their head around what's going on. Why is it important? What's the nuance of these stories? And so, I mean, if that's happening, in the media realm, like, I can only imagine what's happening in greater American society, right? I mean, we interpret a lot of, since I'm here in DC, we interpret a lot of, policy decisions and kind of think through how can we make sure our aunties and uncles, our cousins understand what's coming up for the next administration, what happened in the previous administration when Trump was there, what could happen potentially, and kind of translate that and, message that to real life situations that are happening on the ground. I think our experiences bring forward this and type of nuance that really nobody, no non-Native journalists don't understand, right? And you kind of push that needle forward that our communities need, especially when it comes to a lot of policy decisions in health or the economics. And again, it's all happening here on the Hill. I don't know. There's just so much I think people can learn. Even I'm learning every day. As an editor in our own newsroom of what's happening. And so I think to be at the front lines of it, you're kind of taking an Ellie's perspective and kind of translating it for everyone back at home.
And thank goodness you're there to translate it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Staying informed is so important.
And analyze it, yep.
Yes, thank you, because it's kind of boring sometimes. So I'm glad you're doing that. Yeah. Brian, I'll come your way now with this question of what role can Indigenous journalism play in educating the broader public?
So I'll just reference or return to something I referenced earlier, which is that we are the authentic voice. Indigenous people, we are the unvarnished source of truth about who we are. For centuries, mainstream media has done a disservice to Indigenous people by perpetuating a lot of stereotypes and tropes about who we are, which has made our lived experience much more difficult and has really compounded some of the intrinsic things that we already struggle with. And I think that Indigenous media and the authentic Indigenous voice has the power to set the record straight and to correct some of that misinformation that has been perpetuated and frankly still is perpetuated to some degree today. And so I think that Indigenous media and Indigenous journalists have a tremendous power and a tremendous role to play in correcting some of those past wrongs.
Thank you. Jordan, I'm going to come back your way for the next one with the question, how can Indigenous journalists balance the need to report on their communities with the potential for bias or conflict of interest?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So I always tell our young folks that, we're human. It's inevitable. We're all biased, even journalists. But I think you just can't avoid it. But the key is, I think for journalists is to be aware of that bias and to have the check-ins with yourself anytime you're reporting any story out there, and to also just keep in mind the duties of your job. I mean, when you're out there, you don't have time for it. Like, you have a duty to your citizens because we are public servants. We're providing a service and informing, our readership. And, we're recording history. We're also just focused on the facts and the truth in that. And that's what we try to keep them centered in, right? It takes a lot of practice. I know younger people are really good about it, but also they kind of struggle with it. Even I did. And I don't know, but also this question like made me giggle a little bit. I do get asked this a lot, but I remember one of my back in grad school, one of my professors, or maybe a professor or a colleague said, well, it's like asking like a white person can't cover City Hall. So, and then they would also ask like, why can an Indigenous person cover Indigenous affairs? And I know that's happened a lot in mainstream news, but I'm like, well, you can't cover City Hall, so what's the difference? So I don't know, I just kind of like laugh at that. And as for a conflict of interest, I think Indian country is so small, and I know it's going to happen, but I think the key here is transparency and also having that conversation with editors. If a conflict of interest comes up, and then we talk through it and think, will this affect the story? Will this affect the reporting? Is there somebody else we can hand it off to? Right. But again, transparency is key because, like Francine said earlier, there's very few of us. And so we'll find a way to like work around it to make sure it's the most accurate story we can tell. Yeah, I don't have anything else with that.
No, you keep just dropping like the right answer, and it's like, you got it. No. So Brian, I want to come back to you, and I really want to kind of bring this question into concert with your idea of being the original voice of what then are like best practices for non-Indigenous journalists when reporting on Indigenous issues to ensure accuracy and respect.
So I think there are two things that kind of jump to the front of my mind. The first is if you're a non-Indigenous person wanting to report on Indigenous affairs, do your homework. Don't think that, I'm assigned this story, so I'm just going to pop over to the reservation and join a tribal council meeting and see what's going on and report on it. Do not practice parachute journalism. Do your homework. Learn about the history of that tribe or that community. Develop relationships. That would be, really my second point is develop relationships in the community, not just for the story that you're working on, but as having, developing, contacts that you can have for any, future reporting that you might do. But just understand the community that you're going to be reporting on and recognize that your reporting should have some responsibility toward that community. That you're not just going to go in and extract something from that community so that you can then, perpetuate your career or maybe, the monetary goals of the mainstream or outlet that you're working at. Recognize that you do hold some responsibility to that community. Do your homework, develop relationships, and maintain those relationships, whether you're reporting on a story or not.
Thank you. I think for some of our members that I would be interested to hear, even from your grants background at the AP, it sounds like the 5 R's of Indigenous philanthropy, that idea of respect, of relationship, of responsibility. It just keeps coming back to those same things. So thank you for bringing those.
Yep.
Francine, what are the best practices for non-Indigenous journalists?
There are a lot here that Brian has touched on, but I'm going to focus just on one, and that would be our bingo card. We created a bingo card about 5, 6, 7 years ago, and the bingo card is to be used if your outlet thinks that your story might have stereotypes. And I also bring this up for one very particular reason. Brian said, do your homework. I want to add, don't make assumptions. Don't assume that because a community is in the north or that it is remote, do not assume that it was drawn from poverty. And I can speak from experience that that bingo card works. I used it on an article by the New York Times. And it was called Drawn from Poverty, How Art Was Supposed to Save Canada's Inuit. And I played bingo with that article. I printed the card, the article, and that article not only won bingo, but it made actually some new stereotypes on our bingo card. And the reason I bring up that example is because I worked at APTN at the time, and we have a bureau in Iqaluit in Nunavut, where this story from the Times took place. And so I had our reporter look for that artist. I said, you got to find this artist in this New York Times story. You need to get her reaction to this story. It's our duty as APTN with the bureau in the backyard there in Nunavut to get this story. He waited at the airport. He called. He said, it's been a couple of days. She hasn't come. I said, I do not care if you do not file anything at all this week except that story. And he did it. He got the story. And the headline from the APTN story was a quote from the artist. And the quote was, "I'm not poor." So we completely, debunked a highly inaccurate and stereotypical story. So I would share that story as a lesson and provide the bingo card as a resource.
Thank you. We love a good resource. So I will absolutely be looking that up after this and playing bingo with a few of my own articles I'm suspicious of. Jordan, let me come down to you. What are the best practices for non-Indigenous journalists?
Yeah, since Francine brought it up, AJA also has a lot of reporting guides, how to best report on tribal nations, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and so many more that we've had over the years that the board or members have created. Brian said homework is key. I always tell people, just go read a book. There's also Google. You have resources at your hands to go figure it out. I'm not really a fan, too, of when non-Native journalists come to me for sources because I worked hard for those sources. So don't go to Indigenous journalists and ask for their sources because that takes a lot of relationship building and rapport they built with those folks over years, months, weeks, days, right? I always tell a non-Indigenous journalist too that just because a story is new to you doesn't mean it's new to us or to the communities that you're covering. A lot of people report that IHS is underfunded, and I tell them I've known that since I was a kid. Can you tell me something else that's new? What's going on with IHS, right? And they can always read Indigenous media or Indigenous journalists' work who are working in non-Native organizations because they've been doing the work for years, months, and they do excellent work. I've always looked up just to folks. Graham Brewer is one of them, Tristan Atone, in our own newsroom too. They've done such fantastic work. And part of the newsroom's trainings that we also do for IJA, we've trained a lot of mainstream newsrooms like ABC, excuse me, NPR, New York Times. So that's also an available resource. And somebody from our board or a member comes in and trains them on the best practices. And one of the, at least in my presentation that I do, I always tell them that we are more than our culture and our language. Because we are multidimensional beings. That is part of who we are, but I'm not for cultural stories about powwow or, I love language revitalization, but there's so much more to us, right? We have Native people going to space. We have engineers, we have doctors, we have folks who are furthering medical research, just doing really incredible work, and those are the people to highlight. There's crime going on too, jurisdiction issues, economic policies that we need to look at. So there is more than our culture and our language.
Absolutely. Thank you for, I think, bringing that. And I feel like saying it and saying it over again is so important. What is it, 7 times before people start remembering it? So thank you. Brian, I want to come to you next with your work at the Associated Press, really honing in on that of how can Indigenous media outlets collaborate with mainstream media to enhance the visibility of Indigenous perspectives?
Yeah, this is something that I've advocated for a very long time. I think there should be more collaboration between mainstream outlets and Indigenous outlets, but they can be tricky to navigate. And so I think the two things that I see that probably should be looked at pretty hard before collaboration is started. One is, what are the goals of the collaboration? Like, what is the story that you want to tell? Who is the audience for that story? I think there needs to be a lot of intentionality about kind of the goals for that story, so that you don't get too far down the road in a collaboration and realize that your goals actually are quite different, because that would create a lot of tension with not only within the collaboration, but also with the finished product. And so that's something that should be considered, I think, before a collaboration is formed. The second one is that the collaboration really should not be a burden to the Indigenous media outlet. Many Indigenous outlets are quite small, and they have very limited capacity to participate in collaborations that oftentimes are extra work. And so and this is where I think philanthropy can play a really important role in supporting these kinds of collaborations, because let's say there was a collaboration between a mainstream outlet and an Indigenous media outlet, and philanthropy was able to supply or fund a project coordinator, for example, or some sort of a role that helps just with facilitating some of the technical aspects of that collaboration to help lift that burden off of some of the smaller outlets that may have a lot of difficulty participating. I think that those are really important things to consider, because you don't want a collaboration to end up being so difficult on the Indigenous media outlet or on Indigenous journalists that it sours them to doing it again. You want it to be a benefit. You want it to somehow actually build their capacity to do better reporting in the future. And so that understanding what kind of support is necessary in those collaborations is vitally important. And I think philanthropy can play a role in providing some of that support.
Absolutely. I appreciate you making space for philanthropy in that. And will say, I think I felt a sigh of relief when you said it doesn't need to be on the strenuous for the Indigenous perspective. It needs to be beneficial. Thank you for that. Yes, absolutely. Francine, I'll come next to you on kind of this technology idea of how can tech and digital platforms be leveraged to expand the reach and impact of Indigenous journalists?
That's a great question, and I feel like we are in a position where we need to be leveraging more options and trying to, like Brian mentioned, get a collective together so that those stories that are being worked on can be shared more broadly. One of the things that has been faced by some outlets across the world would be the blockage of news on meta platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. And so that has taken away from the ability of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people across Canada to access news, to share news with one another. So I think that going forward, we're going to be looking for more of our own spaces and our own platforms to deliver, our own news. And that's what we've had to do constantly throughout the evolution of radio, television, and online. We've had to create our own tribal media outlets or Aboriginal People's Television Network in Canada, ICT. So I really see that the technology is going to be something that we're going to embrace a lot more and use it to our own leverage, and not relying on other outlets or other platforms to be able to share our news for us. So I think it's a matter of ownership, that we need to own the spaces where our news is provided, whether that's an app or on a platform that belongs to us or to the rich folks in the world. So that's, I guess, my thoughts and a prediction. And I really see that happening with the work that Brian's doing in bringing all of those outlets together. So we need to do our own thing. We always have and will continue to.
Absolutely. Jordan, let me come to you for how can tech and digital platforms be leveraged to expand the reach and impact of Indigenous journalism?
I very much agree with Francine. I don't think we're leveraging it enough, but I also think that is also due to capacity issues and also accessibility. I mean, one example is analytics, right? Analytics help us figure out who we're reaching, where we're reaching them, what's the behavior of our readers, and kind of bring more content to them, right? But I mean, Google Analytics helps to a certain degree. There's also Chartbeat, but that costs thousands of dollars. And there's other analytic platforms that just cost so much money. And so in our newsroom, we're trying to figure out, what's the best resource for us? What's going to help us? Because we have to figure out, do we need to pay, make payroll, or do we need to cut these other, expenses that we have in our budget? So I think accessibility is a huge part of that. There's AI that's new, and so people have been exploring that. Social media is new, or not new, sorry, it's not new. But so I had the train of thought that just collided with the train of thought. But I used to be a high school teacher, and I taught journalism back in my alma mater. And I remember my students hated writing. And so I had the whole first semester mapped out to write stories. And it was like pulling teeth. So I thought, all right, I'm flipping this. We're going to focus on social media. And they were writing without me thinking about it, right? And so back then I thought, we need to be, focusing on social media first rather than not reporting it that way. I mean, you have TikTok, there's issues with that, but we have TikTok where people get their news, even people in their 30s and 40s, that's where they get their news. And it's also off Instagram. But at least for us in the news industry, that's how you build loyal readers and have them come back to your website, and how you get monetary contributions from them because they do awesome work, right? And I think that's ICT. We've been trying to retrain ourselves. We were thinking, mobile first, and having our news for your cell phones, because everybody reads news from their cell phone. It's not so much a desktop nowadays, and that's where our analytics show. But now it's trying to retrain or rethink, how can we do it social first right now, and going more that direction.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Brian, how can tech and digital platforms be leveraged to expand the reach and impact of Indigenous journalism?
Yeah, for me, the question really comes down to something that Francine and Jordan have both mentioned, which is audience. Who is the audience that you're trying to reach? Generally, who is the audience that you want to reach with a particular story? We all know that information consumption has become very fragmented and segmented these days. People get their information from a very wide variety of sources and a wide variety of platforms. And so I think you really need to look at who is the target audience for this piece, who is our target audience generally, and what platforms are they on? How are those folks getting their information? And then tailor a publishing campaign using the platforms and the social media that are going to reach that audience. And so I think there does need to be almost a bespoke media strategy for almost everything that you publish, based on who it is that you're trying to reach.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Francine, I'm going to come to you next for your individual question if you're ready. But what role can mentorship and training programs play in increasing the number of Indigenous journalists in the industry?
That's a great question. As you heard me say earlier on, how I wished that the Indigenous Journalism Fellowship was around, when I was in my formative years. But I can actually speak from a lot of experience when it comes to mentorship. Throughout my career at APTN, I was provided mentorships along the way as I moved from one position up to the next. For example, I started as an associate director on the studio crew, and I was looking at moving up to being the television director. There were 3 different people who came in to mentor me, 3 different television directors. They all happened to be non-Indigenous. I don't think there was a pool of Indigenous directors to choose from back in 2000, right? So I learned from a sports director, a current affairs director, and a news director. That gave me the skills to be able to direct live television. Fast forward a few years later to become a producer. I had another mentorship where I had one person who was dedicated to my training for an entire year. And it was so formal that, we took every part of the job description and assessed, what my skill level was at. And the goal was to bring me to the skill level where I was qualified for the position. So that, again, that mentorship helped me elevate to be a producer. And the last one, actually the last 2 that I had was, one helped me become the executive producer of news. And again, they were so valuable in that my company was providing that to me. They believed in me so much that they provided these mentors to help me at every stage in my career, at every point of advancement. And that for me, it was always a non-Indigenous mentor until the last one. The last one, it was our news director. And so I could see some differences in that. And I feel that it's really important for us to be able to provide mentorships to our young people, because there are enough of us now that they don't need to be getting non-Indigenous people to mentor them, especially within their own media outlets. So it does go a long way. I've given back and been a mentor myself voluntarily. And, I did mention IJF, the Indigenous Journalism Fellowship that we put on. And I talked about how it has put people in positions. One person that I know from that program, she's now reporting on her local newscast and on television like almost every day. So those investments that we're seeing from funders and contributors, those are helping us get there. But also the contributions that we're making, Jordan mentoring, Brian mentoring, myself mentoring, we're giving back because, we believe in the torch that's been passed to us, and we want to pass that on. So that's such a great question, and it's huge. We need more of our own people mentoring more of our young people.
Oh, absolutely. And it's so encouraging, I think, to hear that is happening. I think for young journalists that may be starting out, it's really hard to see, what that will look like, or if somebody's just considering journalism from, a college campus or from home. Sometimes it's really hard to connect that bridge. And so to see all of you in that space vocally and bringing that into, the operations of what you're all doing out in your roles and in your organizations is so impactful and powerful. Thank you for bringing, I think, your own perspective and personal connection to it too, Francine. And I'd like to, if you don't mind, bring in a question from one of our audience members. And it would be the question from Autumn that says, have you experienced discrimination or microaggressions in the workplace. You know, I think we have mentorship, but we also have to talk about the realities of as well of working sometimes outside of our communities or outside of our relatives network. And if you don't want to speak to that, how have you handled that at least? And what advice would you have to better advocate for yourself in the workplace? And Francine, I'll throw it to you first.
You know, I've been very fortunate as I have talked all this time. I spent over 20 years at APTN, surrounded by my own people. I had Anishinaabe brothers, you know, cutting cameras, and Anishinaabe brothers doing the audio. I've never experienced discrimination or a microaggression in my Indigenous run and owned media outlet. And I'm so thankful for that, because I have heard, and you know, even my own father, who I followed in his footsteps, he experienced those in his career. So I want to give thanks to those who came before us and those who are in those spaces where they do experience those things. And so I can't say that I've had that experience, but I think one way to handle those situations, should someone ever find themselves in that, is seek a network, seek other people that you can talk to about it. It'll help you feel better when you can hear from your Indigenous community. But also look at examples that you can bring to that workplace of another outlet or another company that is doing good in dealing with discrimination and microaggressions. Is your outlet doing any training, or your colleagues learning about residential boarding schools or colonization? I think that the more examples we can bring of a place doing the right thing, then it could help convince a place that needs to speed things up.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I want to open this up. Brian, I'll come to you first on Autumn's question, and I won't make you relive or share any traumas you don't want to, but at least that, like, how have you handled it, or what advice do you have to better advocate for yourself in the workforce?
Well, I just want to kind of piggyback on something that Francine said, which is, you know, to let Indigenous journalists know, especially if you're working in a mainstream newsroom where you may be the only Indigenous person, just know that you're not alone. It may feel like you're very isolated. It may feel like you're alone and that you're carrying a tremendous burden when you're there, but just know that you are not. There is a broad network of Indigenous journalists who have very similar stories, who have found ways to overcome these things in the past. Find, you know, fellowship in your fellow Indigenous journalists. I'll just advocate for, you know, the Indigenous Journalists Association has an annual conference every year where Indigenous journalists from all across North America and internationally come together to learn and to be together in community. And it is incredibly energizing and reinforcing, and can also be just a great place for us to kind of vent about issues that we're confronting in our places of work. So, you know that you're not alone, and that there are places where you can turn and resources for you. And definitely, if you're not already connected to the Indigenous Journalists Association, I would strongly encourage you to do so.
Excellent. Thank you. Jordan, just to finish out this question from Autumn, have you experienced discrimination or microaggressions in the workplace, and how have you handled that?
Oh man. Yeah, and I mean, not necessarily like in the newsroom, but when I was on the job, out reporting. And it's something that I know a lot of colleagues of mine have also experienced just from sources. There are two incidences, one in person, one on the phone, where the source hit on me and made like inappropriate comments. And I was very taken aback. And this was like, I think maybe first 6 months, maybe a year in the job with ICT. And I just didn't know. I was so surprised and I didn't know what to say. And I remember the phone call, I just like laughed and I was like, okay, thanks for your time. And I hung up. And I just like didn't know what to say, because also it was just like very taken aback. And I did report it to my boss at the time, and he said, we have no, zero tolerance behavior, and we will burn bridges if we have to, so you don't have to ever talk to that person again. And I felt so supported in that moment, and that's just something. And once I share that experience, the more, and it's happens more from what I've talked to my colleagues, more Native women reporters or journalists in the field. And so we've talked about, what has been taught to them. One of our former reporters, or ICE producers, told me that if that happens again, just to say that is a very inappropriate comment, that is not acceptable, and just walk away. Or they'll apologize to you, and and we'll take it from the step when it happens there again. It's never happened after that, but it's something like a lot of my colleagues, especially in the fellowship, that we have a talk about in our virtual learning sessions, because it does happen. And we, try to prep them as much as we can. And even in our own newsroom, we try to bring resources and tell, just any journalist, like, this is how you can protect yourself when you're out in the field working with folks. If you're at rallies or demonstrations, take somebody with you. If you're, doing like an on-camera shoot, or doing an on-camera shot, and, they can watch for people, trying to aggravate you and whatnot. So.
Well, thank you, I think, for bringing that, for the vulnerability and willingness and transparency of bringing that in, Jordan. And yeah, so sorry you had to deal with that, of course, but I'm glad you felt supported by the organization that you were with at that time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Of course. Okay, I would like to now we have 2 more questions I'd like to bring in from our audience, and I'll direct this first one to Brian. It's a question from Jenny. How do we get more mainstream media to pick up stories from Indian country?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that collaboration is probably going to be the best avenue. Right now, there are not a lot of natural pathways for sharing that kind of content. The project that I'm working on at the AP hopefully is going to make some inroads in that direction. But I think right now, really the best way to do it is through collaboration. If there is a story that a mainstream outlet is covering, and it also involves an Indigenous community, reach out to the tribal media. If they have a tribal media outlet, reach out to them and see if a collaboration might be appropriate. Or maybe there are multiple communities that are involved with that particular issue. Reach out and see if you can develop a collaboration. And then, of course, a part of that collaboration will be publishing, where all of the outlets publish the product of the collaboration. So I think always look for those collaborations, and just know that there is a vast network of Indigenous media outlets across North America, and a lot of mainstream journalists are almost completely unaware of it. And so, do your homework, find out if there's an outlet like that connected with the community where you might be reporting, and see if a collaboration is going to work.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then for the second one, or the third one now, I would like to bring in, I'll direct it to Francine and Jordan. It's a question from Taria. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Apologies if not, but is there any interest in IJA and or ICT publishing, or is it already exist, an Indigenous or Native style guide that reporters can reference? And I'll throw it to Francine first.
Thanks, Bobby. Yeah, we do have some. Jordan mentioned how we do have like the Tribal Nations reporting guide, and also advice for covering ICWA. But some news, IJA is actually looking at updating our guides as part of our strategic plan, which goes into the year 2026. So, all of those guides that you currently see as resources on our website We're looking at, updating that whole catalog, and it would be wonderful if we could actually bring them all together, like into one book. But that's for IJA. There'll be more to come, so stay tuned and watch out for our updated guides.
Oh, Francine, do you think
Yeah.
philanthropy could support that?
Absolutely, and Jordan agrees too. That there's room for support there, and for those funders to have their logo as part of our guide and printed on our book. So, absolutely, good question, Brian.
Yeah, and there's also, I know a handful of us newsrooms have talked about expanding on like a style guide collectively, beyond, and I think working in with AP too on that. For ICT, we have an in-house style guide that we use. It's in edits right now. But I can share with anybody. I think it's also on our website, on our about page. But you think even with the edits in there, you can kind of see where the train of thought is happening, and like why we're asking questions. And so I think that's kind of a cool part of the process. And people can go find that, like, again, on our about page. I'll still throw comments in there to this day. I know our political reporting intern it's funny, we have a Slack channel for style guide or style notes, and he put in there, how do we spell fry bread? Is it 2 words or 1 word? And everybody's like, oh, you're going to start a whole conversation about what it should be. Or is it fried bread? And we're like, oh, no. And I was like, well, this is what we're using because this is what's found across the board. So it's fun things like that, too.
Absolutely. Well, let me hit you guys with our last question, and then we'll switch into the closing remarks and wrapping our time down together. But Francine, I'll come to you first on this one of how can media organizations and or funders measure and improve their strategies and efforts specifically related to Indigenous representation?
They need to be intentional. And I mentioned a strategic plan that we have. They need to build Indigenous journalism, Indigenous affairs desks. Those need to be built in to their strategies, or they need to create their own Indigenous strategy, which is exactly what the CBC did in Canada. So number one, be intentional, have a strategy, but most importantly, I think is to have a line in your budget for Indigenous journalism, a line that is publicly accessible so that the public can see how much money you're putting into your Indigenous journalism or Indigenous affairs desk, and that is of the utmost importance.
Absolutely. Thank you. Brian, I'll come your way now with how can media organizations or funders measure and improve their strategies?
Hire Indigenous journalists. As we've already referenced a few times in this conversation, there really are not very many of us, but we do have a fairly steady stream of young journalists that we bring up and that we mentor and train and get them ready for the industry. Hire Indigenous journalists and do it knowing that you may need to hire someone who is early career, who maybe is a little less experienced than other people on your staff. And so you need to have the supporting structures in place to make sure that they can develop as professionals. That's going to include access to training programs. That's going to include mentorship, which we've already mentioned. And that mentorship can be both within your organization and it can be outside of your organization. But there needs to be structures in place to support Indigenous journalists so that they can not only become better professionals, but also takes the burden off them of constantly being the resident Indian in the newsroom that has to answer all the questions about what it means to be Indigenous or what it means to be Native. And so to the extent that you can foster that sense of belonging, that you can make Indigenous journalists feel welcome and valued in your newsroom, I think all of that needs to be very intentional, and you need to hire an Indigenous person.
Absolutely. Say it again for the people in the back, right? Jordan, I'll come to you. How can media organizations and our funders measure and improve their strategies and efforts?
They have to have a long-term investment. I think it's Brian who said it earlier. When it's coming to partnerships too, or just trying to think of funding opportunities. At least for me, I wouldn't be interested in being a checkbox just because we need to meet the diversity checkbox. It needs to be a long-term investment because a lot of the timelines that Indian country's on, it happens longer because that trust is needed to be built with them. Also an investment in young talent. I mean, in recruiting, we talked about earlier. Brian said it with leadership training. I'm huge on that just because we have a lot of young people, but we need to have the resources for them to be trained news leaders. And that's understanding, all the facets that come with the industry too. And if people can go to the IJ's conference in the fall, because everyone in the Indigenous journalism realm is there. And so you find, you learn about the conversations that are happening and you're kind of pushing the needle forward and just seeing where the focus is for everybody on the ground. And again, in every part of this little tiny bubble that we're in. It's such a fun time too. Everybody's always just laughing and catching up with one another.
That's exciting. Sounds like a great time. Well, I want to switch now to wrapping down our time together and just want to keep a sacred space here at the end that we like to give you the closing word in. Our audience for these sessions typically spans the entire public sector and beyond. We've got funders and native nonprofits, elected officials, and budding future leaders. But what is something that they can do and they can take from this conversation? Or what's your call to action for what's next? Brian, I'll kick it off with you for this one.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is a call to action as much as it is just an important idea that I think needs to be thought about and hopefully implemented. And that is, I believe that the federal government, tribal governments, and philanthropy should all work together to develop a foundation that supports Indigenous media. And that foundation can play two important roles. It can provide technical support to small outlets that may need help in a variety of areas from both the business and the editorial side. It could also serve a grant-making function to help capacity building at some of these smaller outlets, and also help them move toward having a more independent voice. And so that's something that I think is really missing in this space, but I think could be a real game changer in elevating Indigenous media.
Thank you for a big thought to leave with, right? Like, let's put it into action. Let's secure it. Jordan,
let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Jordan, I'm not committing anything. I do not speak on behalf of my boss. But I get you. Jordan, let me come to you.
Oh man. I think that encourage young people in your communities to even explore journalism. It's not just reporting, writing. Not everyone likes it. Not everyone loves it. We have a lot of visual journalists, people who are photographers, are, photojournalists, producers. They produce packages. They're on camera. They're behind the camera. There are people who do illustrations, data visualizations. And if people like business, the business side of it, the money-making side, we also need those people too. It's really a team effort to make a newsroom work. And it's not just about reporters or, social media folks. There's so much more to the industry. And I would love to have more young people, come and just see what it's about.
Absolutely. An open invitation for all.
Yes, we have a lot of mentors here, as Francine says.
Absolutely. Francine, over to you. Closing out our closing remarks.
My call to action is support us, meet us, get to know us. And we need that support because we have so many issues that you've heard about for the last 90 minutes, so many big dreams and goals, growing an entire garden of future storytellers. And so that support is important, whether it's, funding and or getting to know us. Because whenever we advocate, that's one of the things that we start with, is getting to know one another. Where can we find common ground? It's not all a fight. The advocacy that we do, it's very educational. And, I say that, support us and work with us, because, we don't want to see discriminatory stories about our peoples in mainstream media. We don't produce those kinds of stories ourselves. So we're setting the example, and we're upholding not only our cultures, but also journalism practices in general. So support us and come get to know us at the Indigenous Media Conference in Albuquerque this August, the 13th to the 15th.
Absolutely. Well, it does sound just like such a wonderful time, and we will provide links to all of your websites at the conclusion of our program today. But from the bottom of my heart, I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here, for sharing the good, the bad, the ugly, for that vulnerability to be able to do that, to have those conversations. And Francine, I love the idea of a garden, because it does feel like it is, hearing you all talk about your backgrounds and the obvious rapport that you all have, it is just so indicative of a strong network that is connected and is producing Indigenous excellence in everything. So thank you all for your time today. Igwian. Well, with that, it back to our NAP representative, Shondine, who will be coming in to do our wrap down. So to everybody, thank you for taking the time to join us wherever you are, to submit your questions. The Bad Press documentary I did see was kind of already going off in the comments, so I am adding it to my watch list. I got it on a Post-it note now. So very, very excited. But Shondine, thank you for being here today and for being willing to close this out.
Absolutely.
Miigwech, everyone.
Yeah, Bobby Trey, thank you so much. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Francine and Jordan. And thank you guys as audience members. We really appreciate your collective support in our ongoing programming, and in particular, your support for our member education sessions. I hope that for each of our participants, because in being a part of our audience today, you are an active contributor to the survival and progress of Indigenous journalism, you feel the shared passion that was shared here today with these professionals, the passion that they have for their work and for their communities. While there are many obstacles that still need to be overcome, whether within our own communities or when we are in non-native spaces, this industry is strong, and you can see our mentors are dedicated to sharing their knowledge with younger professionals that are just starting to share their own stories. Part of what makes me grateful to be a part of these Native organizations, yes, Native Americans in Philanthropy, but also IJA, because what are the chances? The thread continues. I'm also a member. Are these critical conversations being shared as resources? Knowledge is power. And I'm honored to have learned so much in such a short session. So as a reminder, this session was open to the public as a highlight of our member benefits here at NAP. And NAP membership is open to Indigenous relatives and non-Indigenous allies. If you're not already a NAP member and want to learn more, please visit our newly redesigned website, nativephilanthropy.org. Or you can also email our team member, Raina Divya Day, personally at rday@nativephilanthropy.org. Lastly, you should be receiving an email with a link to a short survey. Please, we would appreciate if you would take a few moments to share your opinions about what you'd like this session series to look like. It should take about 5 to 6 minutes to complete, but it does provide invaluable feedback for our team and planning. This has been a great start to the year 2025. It is just that, though, a start. Over the next 12 months, NAP is excited to continue offering these convenings for you, your team members and the organization that you're affiliated with. Our sessions continue to meet our members and the public in the moment. We're also excited to begin expanding our membership benefits and engagement at the same time. That said, if you can't join us for our inaugural February member exclusive content in this new series, you can join us back here on YouTube, LinkedIn, and all of our social medias in March. We'll be seating space and listening to one of Indian country's most valuable and needed resources, our matriarchs. Join us in March for Matriarchs Reclaiming Philanthropy. Thank you one more time, Asehet, for joining us, and have a great afternoon.